Welcome, everyone. My name is Andy Olson, and I am a managing consultant with the Gunter Group. I also lead our technical execution practice. So anything from data science to development to automation is a part of my purview. I've been a part of this project from the very beginning, and really excited to be presenting alongside Sean Warley.
Hello, folks. I'm Sean. I'm a senior actuary at the Standard. I work in the corporate modeling department, and I've had the pleasure of working on the model orchestration team for the past year.
Great, thanks. Just a note for everyone, this is a recorded session. Sean and I will be available for questions via the chat, and then we'll hop on Zoom at the end to participate in a live Q&A. So our session today is approachable automation, and it's a case study of how we used Dataiku to streamline actuarial operations at the Standard. Before we get into it, at the Actuarial Technology Summit, we are committed to fair business practices and ensuring a competitive environment. And as members of this conference, you are as well. We appreciate your support. And thank you to our conference sponsors. This couldn't have happened without you, and we are excited to be participating in this. So a special thank you to the Standard, Dataiku, the Gunter Group, and Oliver Wyman. Okay, I want you to picture this. I think it's a situation that actuaries will be very familiar with, and it goes a little something like this. It is business day one, and we're running a valuation model, and we get pinged in Teams by IT. Hey, your valuation data is ready to go. So as an actuary, you go ahead and say, great, I'm going to get this process kicked off. And what's one of the first things you do? Well, probably you're doing a manual query. So a select all statement from your database with a where clause for the date. And once you get your data, you're probably doing a Control A, Control C, and Control V, and dropping that into Excel. So once it's in Excel, you might do a quick review of the data, confirm it's looking the way you're hoping it would, and then you're probably doing a Control A, Control C, and Control V again, and you're moving that somewhere else. In this situation, and in a lot of situations and processes we've looked at, that's just from one Excel tab to the next. So you're moving it from one to the next, doing some augmentation or some cleanup. Maybe you're changing the column names or the headers of those columns and adding in new columns as you go. At some point, you're probably happy with that, and you just move it down the process. And without automation, that data prep is a very tedious task. It's a lot of Excel. It's a lot of manual movement. It's a lot of hands on keyboard and eyes on screen, adding new information and or deleting information, and then moving it forward in the process.
Yeah, Andy, a brief anecdote for you. I've heard stories from colleagues where actuaries required up to 2 weeks of lead time but prior to close. And they ask why. It's to update all my Excel workbooks. I have so many Excel workbooks to update.
It doesn't surprise me given what I've seen, and a slide in just a second, you're going to see that we call it business day one, but I think in a lot of situations, it's more like business week one, and potentially even business weeks to kick off this process. So at some point, you've gone through all of your Excel workbooks, you've added all of your data, you're happy with how it looks. So what's the next step? Well, in our past, it was reaching back out to a different team, probably a modeler, saying, hey, the data is uploaded, it's ready to go, and they go ahead and kick it off. So at this point, we're at the end of the day, it's of business day one, it's almost close to business, and we move forward. So evaluation modeler kicks off the model, hit a couple snags last night. They hit you at 10:30 in the morning and say, all right, that the model finally ran. We're good to go. Can you please review the data? And what does it look like? Well, you're probably going to do a query. You're going to grab it somewhere. You're going to copy it, and you're going to paste it into a tool to evaluate those results. It's probably Excel. potentially Power BI as well. And the intent here, of course, is ensure that the data is ready to be booked to the ledger.
These are sort of controls outside the process that you're using that they don't really connect to anything, just a manual way for you to check.
Exactly. So you're just manually checking verification. It's all eyes on screen and just making sure everything looks good. Now we're 3 days later, or the third business day of the month. You've done all this review. You're confident that it's ready to be booked. So results look good to go. You go back and let everyone know. Let's go ahead and get this booked to the ledger. So what is all of that to say? Well, it's business day one is complicated. This process diagram that we're looking at here more or less reflects that kind of conversation and story we just went through. There's multiple teams. So there's a number of conversations that need to happen, whether it's via Teams, phone calls, meetings, to coordinate this process from end to end. There's a number of stages. There's a data prep stage by your IT organization. There's a data cleanup stage by you in Excel, and then you hand that off in a number of different ways until you're a day or two later.
Imagine, I'm just looking at this right now, Andy. Imagine if you're somebody new to the company and you're supposed to be trained on this. I hope there's some other documentation out there other than this for me to learn.
Yeah, I can't imagine that the fire hose you'd be drinking from if you landed at a new organization, had to be a part of this business day one, and this is what you saw. It's confusing, it's complicated, and there's a lot going on here. So all that being said, well, why would you automate? Well, I think we illustrated an example well of why you would want to, and we're not going to bury the lead here today. We want to talk about what we saw out of this automation project before we get into the details. So first, we've seen almost a 90% reduction in process time from the products that we've onboarded to Dataiku in our modeling orchestration platform. So we've gone from days to hours. That's a huge return on investment from the business in terms of process time and people focused on getting results for business day one. We've also turned it from a process that required multiple people in multiple teams to something that can be run by a single person. So we've gone from people to person, and that person can not only orchestrate the process from end to end, but they can also monitor it and complete it if they choose. And finally, from just a process perspective, we've also added in a lot of automated controls to this process. And we'll talk in detail about those in the future, but really seeing this as an opportunity to reduce a lot of risk for these critical business processes. So from a business perspective, there's so much value in that automation. And there's a lot of time saved, and there's a reducing friction and controls, and those are all great things. But there's other reasons to automate too, and at least consider it in your organization. One of those reasons being that next year, almost half of the entire workforce is going to be millennials and Gen Z. These are tech-fluent generations that are looking for new ways to interact with the organization they're working for, and then push their organization forward. Additionally, tools like Dataiku are really changing the learning curve required to do complex tasks. So these low-code and no-code solutions are creating a lot of new opportunities for employers to empower their teams to do more interesting, more complex tasks way quicker than they could have if they were needed to do that lower level programming or development required to orchestrate a process like this.
And we're not even taking into account the artificial intelligence into this that could become a multiplier to productivity even higher.
Absolutely. I think in the next few years, that's really going to change this curve, and it's going to be less of a flat line. It's going to be much closer to vertical, and I think it's going to be a really interesting pivot in our conversation for organizations as they think through this automation process. And finally, those tools that are coming out and providing the opportunity to reduce or to change that learning curve, they're also providing opportunity for people who had less experience in the development process to do more. And that's actually changing, that's creating this intersection between actuarial and data science. It's growing both in that insurance companies are consuming more and more data every year, but also it's cheaper and easier to process that data. So tools that actuaries might not have invested the time to learn previously, are now much easier to use, much more prevalent, robust, and with Dataiku, provide an opportunity to do it much simpler than you could have before. Okay, so how did we go about doing this? We kind of want to talk through the approach before we get into the solution. So when you looked at that business day one process diagram, it really wasn't an exaggeration. There's a lot of Excel workbook. There's a lot of Excel workbooks as part of that. There's a lot of tabs, and there's a lot of formulas and manipulation happening in Excel. That was a really key part of the process. There's a lot of business logic buried in there. So what the development team did in the beginning was just comb through all of those workbooks and all of those process stages to determine where's the critical business logic being stored. And then at the same time, making a decision around when and where should we execute that business logic in the future. In some situations, it's best to keep things in Python or SQL, but with Dataiku, there's a lot of opportunity to do out-of-the-box recipes, which we'll talk about in just a bit. And then the other really important thing that we had to consider, and really we should consider in any automation project, is creating good development practices for the organization. We want to become great stewards for IT, or giving access to tools that we can do more with than we could before. So what does that look like practically? Well, when we're using Git, or when we're using code and or Dataiku projects, we're using a version control system to ensure that we're storing that code safely and in a version controlled way, so that we can revert changes and or prevent things from getting into production that shouldn't be there. Additionally, we're following best practices and conventions for Python and SQL. So whenever we're writing code in Dataiku or not, we're following best practices to ensure that we're meeting the standards of the organization. And then finally, and we do this in a couple of different ways, reusing code where applicable, and potentially creating shared libraries so that different teams can leverage the same automations, the same calculations, and reducing the complexity overall of the whole organization. And then finally, and Sean will talk to this, we've started to leverage bundles, Dataiku bundles, as a way to manage our version control for these projects as well.
Okay, I can take this, Andy. Bundles are something that we started to explore more of here at the Standard. We did start by utilizing the Git process with Dataiku, and we found it to be pretty intuitive. It worked well with some people might use GitHub. Well, we haven't used Azure DevOps. And we were able to hook it up to a remote in ADO. Problem we were having is that there were a bit of merge conflicts that were happening, particularly with some of the JSON files that we had to go in. We had to be careful and wait for other people to finish their merge before you did your merge, and that just wasn't very efficient in terms of time savings. Luckily, there is an option within Dataiku to use what's called bundles, which is sort of an internal version control to Dataiku. You don't need to worry about Git. You don't need to learn Git or learn pull or merging or fetching or any of that. All you need to do is follow the process as seen in this diagram right here, where you do your work on what's called the design node. Normally, you're a sort of a branch. And then once you're finished with your changes, you would commit it to sort of commit, and I use those quotes, commit it to the deployer node, which is sort of a staging area where it could then be sent to your sort of production, which we call our automation nodes. So that would be either non-prod, which can be sent automatically for testing, sort of staging area, or the prod area, which is your production area, which is under a safeguard by the govern node, which is an area that's devoted towards approving, as sort of takes the place of the approval process for the pull request in the previous form of version control. It's a process where you'd have multiple approvers plus a final approver that can look at it within the govern node and approve it for production, all within Dataiku. And yes, as I said before, the deployer node, the bundles must pass the governing process, and you have a list. And what I didn't want to mention also is that these bundles are the projects that you have along with all your data. It's sort of a snapshot of your project as of the time, which would then be held in the deployer node and then sent off to the automation node via the govern node. One of the things that we really want to do with automation is that we realize that we can't have one software program that does everything. Dataiku is nice, but it could potentially handle everything, but it may not be the most efficient tool. Luckily, what we have is ability within Dataiku to call out to separate systems and ask them to handle the tasks that they're best suited for, such as GZY Axis for actuarial calculations, Databricks for data handling and processing, and Confluence for documentation. And through our engineering team here at the Standard, we set up a process to send a one-way information packet to trigger a job in GZY Axis or Databricks using what's called the gRPC, the Google Remote Procedure Call, which allows for sustained contact between systems even when buffering, but it is one way. And which tool does what? And there's as I said, actual considerations. Actual calculations, as I mentioned before, happen in Axis, but actual considerations happen in Dataiku. The bulk processes, as I mentioned, happen in Databricks, but for actual considerations, such as what assumption is set for which cohort of policies or what criteria goes into a cohort of policies, that is best set in Dataiku, whereas the rest of the bulk processing, connecting names to addresses or other hidden sort of information is best done outside of Dataiku in Databricks.
Yeah, this is a point I want to highlight, and I think in any IT project, we really need to be intentional about this line that we're drawing between systems. In every organization with multiple systems, there's going to be a lot of capability overlap between them. And when we're automating across many of them, we have to make a really thoughtful decision about when and where should we do this task. And as Sean said, really important part of our goal for this platform was to make this a wonderful experience for the actuary, which is why the actuarial considerations are happening in Dataiku. And then we've made some decisions around keeping some of those external factors outside of Dataiku.
As we discussed over, controls is a very important part of the process. And in Dataiku, what we've employed what's called preventative data checks. As mentioned before, the data checks on our sort of before system was sort of descriptive. The person will say, "Oh, I see these as wrong. Can you do some manual checks?" Person does a manual check and says, "Okay, they're all right. Let's send it off." Here, we've actually managed to code the data checks into Dataiku, where we've implemented what's called preventative data checks. And this sort of harkens back to the idea of lean manufacturing, in that you don't create a bunch of product and then look at the product later and see what the defects are and exclude them that way. What you do is you stop the process at its source whenever an error is found and go back to the start, and that's what these do. That's what these do. Dataiku has given us the ability to implement our data checks within our data flow, that if they see that there's something wrong with the data, we'll stop the process, then go back and fix the data, and then move on forward. And that gives you two advantages. One, it saves time that you don't go through the entire process and then figure out where you've gone wrong. And second, it doesn't potentially allow for results stemming from bad data to circulate outside of the evaluation system.
Yeah, if we go back to our anecdote, Sean, and think through, it took 3 days with relatively good data in our example, getting to the end of that process and realizing you missed something along the way, especially in the upstream system, and kicking it off again. Well, now you're definitely past that first week. So I think this is a really big win and an excellent addition to this platform and producing robust automations.
And one of the things we also look for in our system is we want to build something that's reusable. We don't want to have extra code or extra flows for multiple processes that would turn to spaghetti and require reams and reams of documentation for any user to understand, be them new or even seasoned. And that's what we're able to do in Dataiku. We're able to build a platform, not a point solution, where we can have processes repeated for multiple purposes. For example, you can see on here, we have a process for stat, and we have a process for LDTI, gap. And they're pretty much the same process within the same scenario, just a different measure of code. And extending from that, we're also able to we're also aiming, to have multiple products run under the same flow.
This is, again, another really important highlight for how we think about automation at the standard. And, if we go back to that business process we looked at for business day one, that was for one product. Well, if you've got multiple products that all have really complex workflows like that and complex data flows, that your business complexity grows exponentially. So it's really a North Star of this program is to ensure that as we've built this out, we are making it as reusable as possible and making as much of a platform as we could to reduce that complexity as much as possible. So that's how we went about it. Sean, why did we ultimately select Dataiku?
Well, there's several reasons. One is that Dataiku is very versatile. It can speak to the novice in terms of technology, as well as the advanced person. Actuaries or no. I know a lot of the actuaries I've spoken to are really keen on the out-of-the-box recipes, which provide intuitive ways to produce our workflow. You see some examples there. There's a filter step. Look at the funnel. There's a group by step. There's a stacking step. There's the ubiquitous prepare step. These are all very well received by the actuaries for them, because they can visualize where their data goes. And the other part of it that appeals to all of us is the versatility, in that if you have something, and we found that this is usually not the case. Usually most of the code can be handled by these out-of-the-box recipes. But if there are cases where they cannot, Dataiku does provide the ability to have recipes coded in either SQL or Python for additional flexibility that we found to be quite effective. Preventative data checks, as we mentioned before, are very important to be able to stop the process when a data check has occurred and not follow it to its conclusion of an error-filled conclusion. The data checks are rather simple to set up. They follow the same idea as before, is that they're out-of-the-box metrics and checks. So you can see on the left, we have a records count. And you see on the middle, we have a check count, saying that the record count has a minimum of 1, i.e. check that there's data check that there's data this month. Because what happened if you ran Databricks and it did its bulk processing, but the data, the precursor data wasn't available? Well, our data check will handle that and say, oh, and the fail the process and say, oh, go where the source is, and then we'll know that our error is in Databricks. That is an example of how, and we've encountered several times in our runs before, of how Dataiku can save a lot of time and stress. And as always, Python is available for coding more complex data checks. We use Python quite a bit more here in our data checks, and it's quite easy to use. And you see the example on the right of this checking for duplicates. Real-time documentation. Documentation is something that's we all know is incredibly necessary, but it's hard to not only create but update. And prevent stale documentation is pretty much the standard for a lot of companies out there. Unfortunately, thankfully, we've found that Dataiku sort of puts documentation up in your face a bit. First and foremost, as you can see, there's spaces within each recipe and data set for us to document the code, and it'll stand out if it's not there. And this provides us the ability to keep up to date on our documentation through whenever we update a recipe in Dataiku. And also, if in case there's need for more narrative-like structure, Dataiku provides a wiki for us to fulfill that.
Yeah, this is another place where I think Dataiku really shines, and that process diagram we looked at the beginning became stale actually really quite quickly, not just because we were doing this automation program, but because like most things in a dynamic environment, it's really hard to nail down exactly what a process looks like from day to day. And I think Dataiku does a really excellent job here of ensuring that you can have both like a visual story to your process and then also keep it up to date.
And one other addition to that is that as I mentioned before, Dataiku talks to Databricks and Access. It also talks to Confluence, and it's not out of the box, but through the Dataiku API, we managed to create a program where we can publish all of this to Confluence. And so instead of manually updating a Confluence page, you can just update Dataiku as you're programming it, run the pipeline, and it would update your Confluence documentation like that.
I think that's incredible and an excellent use of a plugin, in my opinion, on how to make this just an all-around better tool for the organization. So those were some of the reasons why Dataiku was selected to be the tool of choice for this platform. There's going to be a couple more reasons that kind of come out of the next section on what Business Day One looks like today. But please continue to ask us questions in the chat or at the end. Okay, Sean, so that was the approach. We went through the approach. We determined why we selected Dataiku, but walk us through, what does Business Day One look like today?
Well, there doesn't really need to be a Teams chat. Or of course, you could have one just to tell people, oh, I'm starting it or it's done. But you can pretty much do it yourself. You see here in our sample scenario, we have a bunch of scenario steps set up here, and the first step we would simply set our variables. So typical variables you would set for a month are what's the valuation date? Is it an LDTI run or not? What's the source of your Access data set that you want to do, and where do you want to save it? Once we saved our variables, then we run our preflow in Databricks. It will kick off the Databricks adapter. And this utilizes a thing called plugins that are sort of utilize APIs to create adapters that talk to the other programs. As you can see here, these plugins integrate with other systems. some components that are these pre-model steps that we talked about, in addition to other steps that will come later, but I can go into now. There are copy items back and forth from Databricks, and also the post-model run. And you see in the bottom left is some of the code that our engineers have devised to make all that happen, all within Dataiku. Build a flow. That's the next step. So this step takes the information from Databricks, prepares the data according to the actuarial considerations that we discussed earlier, and then sends it back to Databricks. And this is probably the thing that people envision most when they're thinking about Dataiku. And the thing that's most visually appealing is the flow. And we've arranged the flow here into this flow serves several purposes. It serves stat and LDTI broken out into flow zones. So we have a flow zone for our our in-force data. We have a flow zone for our assumptions data, and they're both reused by both stat and LDTI. And what you do is you tell Dataiku to build the end result, and it would force build the remaining steps, and you can see it as it goes from left to right. So some previous processes, you may run a program, and it would just run. It would just run, and then it would tell you when it's done, and it could take 20 minutes, 30 minutes. You're just waiting. Here, they allow you to look at each step, which I think is very appealing to the actuaries too, so they can track it and see how long it will take for the flow to run. Oh, it's about halfway through right now. Now, once the data is set and the data flow, it's back into Databricks. We use Databricks as a way station for the process. The data, it always starts in Databricks and ends up Databricks with each part of the process. We would send it to SQL, where it can be ingested by GGY Moody's Access. We then run Moody's Access from Dataiku, which I'll go into, and then after Moody's Access is completed, we then transfer it back from SQL into Databricks. And as I mentioned before, we have a robust integration with Access. In addition to our integration with Databricks, here it's kind of different. We utilize Enterprise Link, and we have some jobs set up in Enterprise Link. You can see some of those typically on the left. You can create a version control data set. You could check it out. You can check it in. You can update. We've update data set parameters all through Enterprise Link, all through Dataiku. We don't even need to go into Access and touch it. We can just program it all from here. And as I mentioned before, we have some components that I mentioned before. We create a disconnected copy, or utilize a version control data set as if you wanted to save your production data set, as we found that we like to use, or perform data checks, check if the data set exists or doesn't, and all through Enterprise Link. And so your data has gone to Access. We calculate our reserves or our projections, and now it comes back out. Dataiku also provides you the ability to check your data after the fact through the dashboard. You can bring it back into Dataiku, format it in a table, and look at it from your dashboard. So the same dashboard that you used for your checks, and to check that there were no duplicates, to check that you had data, can be used to visualize your model output and ensure that they are as expected. And finally, once the individual is signed off on the output, you can just send it to the ledger through another Databricks job.
I think this is just incredible when you see what was and what is now, and of course there's a number of steps there, but some of those steps are intentionally left in so that we can run parts of that process if we need to, or run it end to end if we'd like. But at the end of the day, being able to go from source system to the ledger in a day with more or less the click of a button is really pretty amazing. And again, that's days to hours. and it's people to person. It's a really amazing win for the standard, and it's all powered by Dataiku and the engineers and the team that brought this together. So again, a final time, we had a complex, lengthy business day one before, multiple days, multiple people communicating asynchronously, not always being able to get back to each other immediately because we have other tasks to do at work. A lot of manual movement of really key data, and additionally, a lot of manual calculation in that Excel was holding a lot of business logic for the organization in a number of different spots, different tabs, different workbooks. A lot of it was moved around with Control A, Control C, and Control V.
And in our example, it went smoothly. It doesn't always go smoothly, and people aren't as bright and chipper as they were in that sample conversation.
Exactly. In this example conversation, we did this all in a couple of days. But as we highlighted in the presentation, if data got to the end of this process and if something was incorrect, we're starting all over again, and we're starting this chat over again. And there's a lot of confusion around that. So this is what was this long, complex diagram, and what we've moved towards is more or less a couple buttons, a couple scenarios in Dataiku that control this process with the future intentional stage gates. The platform works for multiple products, and we're onboarding more. It's got controls, it's got living documentation, and then the plugins really allow for that cross-system communication. So making that business day one really a business day one activity. And this is what this process at a high level looks like today.
It's a lot simpler, a lot easier to digest.
It's so much simpler. It's easier to digest. It's going to be easier to bring new people onto the team to run this process in the future. And the whole point of this whole project was to produce efficiencies. I mean, we were trying to find opportunities to give the standard return on investment when it comes to automation. But there's so much more to automation. If you're doing it well, we need to be thinking about that additional time and making that time saved worth more than it was previously.
Yeah, the time saved is very important because, as a lot of our audience would know, actuaries are expensive. So we don't want them Control A and Control C and Control V all the time. We don't even want our analysts to be doing that. Our entry-level people, we want them to be learning, and we want them to be learning about actuarial work, and that's what automation provides. It provides not only a new way of doing things and also saving time, it provides opportunity. And something, Andy, that I'm really excited about is that we've really focused on Dataiku as an orchestration engine, where it's worked wonderfully in this presentation. But I'm really excited to utilize Dataiku's machine learning tools. And once we build our orchestration engine, that's something I'm really looking forward to and really excited about.
I'm excited to see it as well. Dataiku offers so much functionality there, and I think with our maturity around understanding how to move data through Dataiku, and then leaning into those tools of the future, I think it's gonna be a really exciting time to be an actuary at the standard. So that's what we had for you today, Sean. I really appreciated working on this presentation with you and working on this project in general. Thank you so much. Please let us know in the chat, or we'll be ready to hop on the Zoom in just a second to answer any questions that you might have. But thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you everyone for attending.